called the Rail Report, which established the structure of the modern, what I call the modern federation, where the AFM was at that time divided into two parts, the Electronic Media Services Division and the Symphonic Services Division. And he created all of that structure, and we got it through the AFM. They passed. The board, the International Executive Board, agreed to pass that report and implement it. And we also made changes to Federation bylaws. We put the orchestra services program in so that if we ran into another circumstance where an orchestra and its union were fighting, the Federation could take the orchestra away from the union rather than, nuke, as we call it, nuke the local, or, put them in trusteeship. It's always difficult for the Federation to do that, but if they could just remove the orchestra, then they could, the idea was they could give everybody a chance to cool down and, put the orchestra under Symphonic Services Division, which people regarded much more favorably. That was Lud Waldeck was the head of Symphonic Services in those days. And
of course, Lou had come out of the symphonic world.
Yes, and he came out of the ICSOM world too. He was he was a delegate. He was a delegate.
New York City
Ballet.
Right. He was a tuba player.
Yeah, tuba player, New York City Ballet, and he decided when they decided to create the Symphonic Services Division and make it a presidential assistant, he was interested in the job. So Fred and I both maneuvered to get him the job, and he was the logical contender. But so we did. I put all of my efforts that way, rather than the way that Fred was. Although I tried to do some of the things that carry on some of the threads that he had established about workplace satisfaction. That was when I met Richard Hackman, Richard Hackman from Harvard, who had done a bunch of studies, including some studies of symphony orchestras, including that very big one with the Berlin Philharmonic.
That's right. Where
he determined that musicians had lower job satisfaction than, garbage men, I think. And
actually, it was. I think the one I remember was Federal Prison Guards.
Federal Prison Guards. That's it. That's it. That's right.
Actually, that's on for those of you watching. That some of that material is on the Polyphonic site in the Harmony archives, if you want to go take a look.
Right. Well, Hackman was a real interesting guy. He was a trombone player, amateur trombone player, so he liked music quite a bit. And anyway, I brought him to some conferences, and one time he came into a conference and he talked about women in symphony orchestras, and I was like, I don't know what's going to happen when he talks about this subject. We may have a revolt on our hands.
Right.
But the women just absolutely loved what he had to say. It was an evening session, and it went 2 hours over its appointed time, and that was one of those ones where it's better to be lucky than skillful.
Right.
But so I had Hackman talking about those kinds of issues. Plus, I was trying to reach out and get some rapprochement with the league. In those days, it was called the American Symphony Orchestra League, not the League of American Symphonies, or
the League of American Orchestras.
League of American Orchestras, excuse me. But I was trying to get some rapprochement going with the league, and I was trying to get some. I was trying to do some more of the work on job satisfaction, and of course, at the same time, we were trying to get the rail report passed by the Federation and then implemented, because it took a lot to implement it. And so it was a very busy time. And then, of course, there were media negotiations going on, and those were what I would call the happy times in media negotiations. It was real black and white. It was the companies and us, and it was us against them, and we didn't particularly use any cooperative methods of negotiating. We just went in and pounded the table and generally roughed up the other side as hard as we could. So that's how I differed from Fred, in that I took my whole approach to the union. I went down that route. And then, of course, I left in '96, and you took over then, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Right. What about the AFM presidents you dealt with? You dealt with a number directly.
Yeah, I dealt with, actually, going back to '75, the first AFM president I ever saw was Herman Kennan. And I remember going to a national media negotiations in New York, and somehow we managed to worm our way into those media negotiations because it was unheard of for player representatives to go to federation negotiations.
That's what used to be called phono labor, right?
Right.
Well, that of course really was that was the big agreement.
That was the big agreement, yeah, that involved us. We weren't involved in the motion picture or agreements, but the first AFM president I met was Herman Kennan. He basically instructed us to sit in the corner and be quiet. So, of course, we didn't. We did sit in the corner, but we weren't quiet. And then let's see, I'm trying to...
Kennan died.
Kennan died, and then the next guy, who I can't remember now, took over. And he didn't last very long either. And
Was
then
it Davis,
Victor,
maybe?
Davis, that was
That's
it.
right.
That was it. It was Davis. And then he didn't last very long either. But then Victor Fontealba took over. And we actually got a good relationship going with Fontealba, who could be very difficult. He was very autocratic. But we got a good relationship going with him, and he trusted us that we weren't there to leave the union. We were there to work with the union. So we actually got along with him quite well. And I remember in 1980 we invited him to an ICSOM conference. That was unheard of. Usually no union officers were invited to ICSOM in the early days. And he just loved it. I mean, people doted on him while he was there, and he just couldn't get over it, So he really enjoyed it, and we had a very good relationship with him. Then in '86, or
87 maybe.
I think it was '87. I think you're right. It was '87. They were very unhappy with Victor. There was a whole group there. Marty Emerson was very unhappy with Victor, and so was the Recording Musicians Association. And they put together a coalition and unseated Victor. And Marty was the president, but Marty was very unhappy with ICSOM because ICSOM had sided with supporting Fontealba, which was not a smart thing to do. Usually you should try to keep neutral in those negotiations because you have to work with whoever is in there.
I think that's been pretty much the policy ever since.
Yeah, it's pretty much. Or if you're going to do it, you have to do it real quietly. You have to definitely follow Machiavelli when you do that. But anyway, then I came back as chairman, and Marty reached out. He was mad at the chairman that I succeeded, Melanie Burrell.
Right.
But he wasn't mad at me, and Marty and I established a decent relationship. And Marty loved Bill Rail, and Bill Rail was always in there talking to him when we brought Bill in as a consultant. So we were able to get things much more straightened out. And although Marty had a hard time accepting the fact that we would go in and rough up the recording association. The Federation didn't like to mess them up, because of the Special Payments Fund.
Right.
But we could have cared less about the Special Payments Fund. We just wanted to rough them up. So we would go in and rough them up in the negotiations, and they didn't like that. But they would just throw their hands up in the air, and that's all we would try to do, is just keep the status quo. And then by the time I had left, then Mark Tully Masagli succeeded Martin Emerson.
Right.
And then Steve Young succeeded Mark Tully Masagli.
Who was actually a bassoonist. And
who was actually a bassoon player. He was the president of the Boston Local and a bassoon player. Actually, he was a woodwind doubler. He was a doggone good saxophone player, besides being a good bassoon player. And he, as a matter of fact, he played a lot of Broadway shows that came through Boston where he had to double. But he was definitely, there was a big battle about that, getting him elected president. But we managed to get him elected president. And he was, of course, very friendly to ICSOM. And to me, I mean, I had a very close personal relationship with Steve, and to a certain extent I still do. I talk to him as much as I can. Right. But Then I left, and then you came in, and you know